right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Carrie Hansen. I am the Vice President of SOCAP, Social Capital Markets. Thank you for being here today for part 2 of our 365 virtual series. We had originally planned this series to be held in April, earlier this year. And due to the coronavirus, we ended up pivoting to June. And then in June, we decided to launch this multi-part series. And the premise of our entire series, the pieces that are weaving us together, we will be talking about policy and all of the many facets of how policy is showing up and how we need to be using policy to further make changes and make durable changes. In addition to that, we also have a thread of racial equity and centering racial equity with intention in all of our work so that we can be ensuring that these long-term policy changes and durable changes within our communities and our companies and our personal lives are taking place. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome this amazing panel today to discuss governance, policy, and accountability. And with that, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors who have stuck with us and not only been a part of the pivot, but have really helped us to shape these conversations and bring these conversations to life with all of you. And to get us rolling, I am going to turn it over to Erika, Seth, Davies. She is our facilitator for our entire series. And not only that, she is the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab and has been a big part of us being able to not only understand, but respond to our current conversations and really help bring the 365 series to kind of a national conversation as well as a hyper-local. So the format for today, we are going to start off with a lightning bolt, and then we will move to a fireside chat. And then following the fireside chat, we will have Q&A with all of our speakers. So during this time, please feel free to send over your questions and your thoughts, and we will make sure that those are surfaced throughout the entire conversation. And then with that, Erika, over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you for this amazing platform. To your point, that is both national and hyper-local at the same time. I'm always thrilled to lift up the work that's happening in Baltimore and to spotlight the voices of some of the amazing leaders that are here in this city. So this is an exciting opportunity, and I'm actually really excited in particular about this discussion. It's not always the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's governance, it's accountability, it's those things that make us answerable for our actions, and this is where the systems start to change as well. And so we're at a time right now where people are talking about systemic racism and how we need to have sustainable change, and this is all true. But how do we make that happen? What are the levers that we can look to for that? And how do we get here in the first place? And so I think when we're talking about racism as a system of advantage and disadvantage that was then made structural through policy, quite frankly. So colonial slave laws, citizenship, who's a citizen and who isn't, Jim Crow laws, redlining, all these things were accumulating advantage and disadvantage and have brought us to this point where we are today. And those are the things, the policy and the practices that are embedded within that policy that we're going to have to use to dismantle the system as well. And so when we're talking about this work and this conversation today, starts to look at governance, which is a full set of processes, either by a government, a network, a market. We're all subject to governance in some way, shape, or form. But it's the way that the rules of the game are established, what norms and actions are structured, regulated, how people are held accountable. And so in this conversation, we're going to look at leveraging governance and accountability for change. How do you do that and use, how do you practice that? How are people thinking about that actually at this moment in time? What are the levers that are in place, and how can we even create new ones? So our speakers from these very seemingly disparate spaces will talk more about how you think about this in different levels, whether it is accountability to youth, accountability to community, to government. How do we work through a process of change, again, using some of these structures, or shifting to new ones, and what are the bridges in between? So we have with us today, as Carrie said, Olu Butterfly Woods, who is the executive director of Dewmore, and is a longtime friend and colleague. We went to high school together. So I'm a quick shout out to McDonough for that. We also have with us Kera Ritter, who's the president of the Ritter Group, and also the transition manager for the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. And we also have Tiffany McGee, who is the CEO and Chief Investment Officer, Institutional Client Services for Momentum Advisors. So again, couldn't get into more different spaces, but I think once you stick with us to this conversation, you'll see the common thread throughout. So with that, I will turn it over and ask Olu to share with us about Dewmore and talk about the work that you do, and the process that you all are going through at this point around accountability, and who you all feel you're accountable to at this point.
Crazy gives me strength, the heart of 10 men working hard to move out of a tenement. I lost the Ace of Pentacles, sent out my sentinels for the retrieval of the old school jewels. Couldn't wait for people to bow to be queen again. Couldn't wait for to repair my crown to be mean again. I know I'll be in the heart of men, so I pardon them. I'm on a mission to undo the division, ruled by unite and conquer. Fighting no longer feel the pulse getting stronger like the beat of a conga. I'm so brilliant, but I need a couple million to stand with me. That's worth more than fame and money. Thought they were greedy because they still wanted more. It's called being needy because all they got, they still poor. And spirits chasing the emptiness, they hear it echo in their chest where there should be a heartbeat. The mind missed, but the heart sees. Where the body can't, spirit parts to see. You say, but this is real life. I know it's just a tease. If you will, you could adjust the breeze. I release you from this game of freeze tag, lying with dogs thinking you a flea bag, far from the truth, trying to be a star on a roof, far from the sky, wondering why we only shine bright as a public school bathroom mirror. It's hard to sparkle here. Ask Irene Kera. Who's going to take care of the children? Olu Butterfly. Who'll be keeping it sizzling? Olu Butterfly. Who's making a killing and bringing it back to the village? Olu Butterfly, Olu Butterfly, Olu Butterfly. My name is Olu Butterfly, and I am the interim executive director of More Baltimore. We are an organization that uses art to promote civic engagement. And I'm here to just provoke people into thinking about 3 points, and also to share where we are within our journey as an organization that is currently 7 years old. So I had some slides, I don't know if they're there, but the first proverb I wanted to bring up is, he who thinks he is leading and has no one following him is only taking a walk. And that is to just remind us as we look at, and if you're like me, there you have people in your circle, if it's not you yourself, sort of shaking their head at our national so-called leadership. But this is an opportunity to actually dig into the leadership of self, and to start there, and to start with your family, chosen blood, and your community, to really dig in and move past this space of helplessness, and to take our sphere of influence and rock it. My second one, the next slide, proverb from one of my favorite poets, June Jordan. We are the ones we have been waiting for. What I hear missing in a lot of policy discussions that I have been privy to is respect for people. We don't have to protect ourselves from them. They are amazing. They have been living their lives all their lives. They are experts in it. So as we are looking for solutions or how to do things, they need to be at the table in a very different way, whether we're talking about education, the way that our communities protect themselves, respect for people. And then my next the next slide is if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Building things that are based on agreement from the foundation, which is not the case in our greater society. There's a lot of these spaces were built on extracting labor, theft, and more. So the idea of informed consent, that places can operate where everybody is actually in agreement, is something that we have to get back to. And that authority actually comes from being able to take care of people. It is not a violent thing. It is not a forced thing. And so where Dewmore is in our journey, next slide, is listening to young people has led us in a very good direction. And we're seeking to decolonize our organization, our processes, and the way that we are currently doing that. A lot of what we do started off in the living room. We did youth-centered programming. We had a group of young people who we formed into a team, and they went and represented Baltimore nationally with their art. And since that time, we've been moving towards youth-led. So there are open mics that they have decided that they wanted to put on. Done this at several times, and in a lot of ways, I prefer working with them sometimes than older people. They have so much passion, and they're going to do the tickets, they're doing the events, and it's been beautiful to watch them blossom. And we're moving into a new space, and it has been not necessarily perfect, which is more towards youth governance, more towards what is the future of our organization, who is going to be stewarding it, and we want to do a more cooperative model. We realize that the people before us, they're not expendable. You had an issue going to a workshop, the teacher workshop, with your ride, you're fired. No, they are in it for the mission, and the accountability that we all have is towards that mission. So having it where we're sort of setting up apprenticeships for people to begin to serve in the way that the organization needs. So recently, our young people showed us that we were doing some things right, and they decided they wanted to do something when they witnessed with our nation what happened with Brother George Floyd, and they knew they wanted to do something about it, and they would not take no for an answer. So Dewmore is not in the business of protest. This is not a good time. You can't get a permit, our insurance, etc. But they decided they wanted to exercise their civil disobedience and to put on a protest. And in the end, that protest brought together 15,000 people. It was beyond what they imagined. And that train running, we had to figure out how we could support them and keep them safe. They did it themselves. So that was just an interesting journey. So we did not make them. They're not, since the beginning, we've had to explain their voice. Sometimes it will make you uncomfortable. It is their truth. It's not cute. And so the idea of like young people and the solutions that they bring to the table and making more space for that has led us in the correct direction. So I don't know if I have more time, but I was trying to fit it in within the time period and answer any questions.
You do have more time if there's anything else that you want to share in that. I know I have a couple of questions based on what you have shared so far. Primarily, that's hard. That's real hard to step back and let young people lead. You just had a slide up about you can go faster, but who knows the road? And so how have you balanced that out such that the very real considerations, to your point of insurance and permits that can potentially be barriers. How have you had to deal with, and what have you done to navigate this balance between the energy and the passion and the commitment of youth and honoring that mission of transitioning to a youth-led organization?
Well, I'm here to learn as well, because that concept of just when we let liability lead, we often don't do best practices at all. And so if I just was like, hey, I don't know about that, and we just sort of stepped all the way back, a real opportunity would have been missed, and that's kind of whack. So, but we do need to be here tomorrow. We need to exist, and so that was weighing heavy on us, and especially their safety. We had a choice to go one of three ways: to forbid them to do it, like you will not do this. I know that you're passionate and you want liberty and you want to be engaged for a better community, and that's what we say we're about. But no, you cannot do this. We could have went in that direction. We could have went completely hands off, like, you know what, good luck with that. And so what we did was an interesting hybrid, which was to connect them to other people whose work that this was. Like, we don't do protests. We do civic engagement, we do art. So not protests, but organizing, et cetera. So they, this was actually something that we had done in 2015. My students, during the uprising around Freddie Gray, they decided, I was teaching at a school that was directly impacted. It was in the neighborhood, and they were also impacted by when the buses decided to leave everybody and there was a ensuing riot. They were the ones directly impacted, so they decided to do poems at the police department. I can tell you it was a very different result after years have passed. So the community came out. That's the only actually protest that I went to during that time period because they invited me, the young people invited me. And then, you know, fast forward to here, there's so much more fertile land here in Baltimore since the uprising. People really have used that as momentum to get together and to organize. So they were on the front lines, but at the same time, they were part of a continuum. And that is what made it, and we want to give them all of our wisdom, like what happens now? They're kind of in that space, like, you know, but the idea that they formed all the relationships themselves. They came up with ideas, vetted them, trashed them, and they did that like themselves, like the sound, you know, it was beyond their wildest imagination of turnout, but it was an alignment. And because people were looking for something that was a trusted thing. They're like, I want to do something, but I want to go somewhere that I can trust, that's not co-opted, there's all this distrust. So there was a trust in them, and what they did was in alignment with a sentiment that was throughout, and they were the brave ones to do it.
Yeah, there's so much to be gained from just hearing about how that came together, the collaboration. So instead of just throwing your hands up and saying, we don't have the expertise ourselves, so you can't, therefore you can't do it, but to go out and find the partners, the trusted partners to help with this, people who've done this work before. The civic engagement, I mean, I'm just, you know, amazed by how young people have been activated. Change does not happen from people who are comfortable.
No, people don't do it, and every
right.
time people get annoyed or like, why are they doing it this way? And maybe they're not even doing it right. But definitely, many successful social movements have come from the young people, from children specifically. I remind people that weekends were brought to you by children. They were working in the factories, and maybe we excused ourselves. We found a way. I'm saying we because now I'm in the old people category, but we found a way to try to make it work. They're like, this is not correct. And they are correct in saying this is not correct. And they may not do things the way we would think. And we're like, oh, you want to do this? Like, why do you want to do it like that? So having to just really be mindful and minding them and what they have to say and bring to the table, and then supporting it. Because what I think we can do differently is, I think this is the way it's supposed to work developmentally. The young people are supposed to say, hey, you know what, there's a better way to do these things. But they're not just supposed to feel like they're on their own, like they're inventing something. There are blueprints that they are benefiting from, and they should feel supported. So that's what we can do. And, you know, and I used to think that that you had to like study and figure things out to make solutions. Like you had to really, you know, go get your master's and PhDs. And I'm not saying don't do those things, but those simple solutions are really the solutions, honestly. There's so much that we do that is around protecting systems of hoarding that it makes things really complicated, and we feel like that's how it has to be. But they can see and they're like, why are you doing this that way? Why is this bus stop over here and this one over here? But people are just trying to get somewhere. Like, I just had that thought recently, and like, oh, that's because this separate company is just trying to cater to this. It's not convenient for the people, but it's convenient for somebody that's trying to protect property and systems of hoarding. So there's so many things that don't make sense, and they can call it out. So like, hey, this doesn't make sense. And you're like, actually, you're right, it doesn't.
So sounds like having to stay accountable to mission and accountable to youth voice, and developing this new model, or this transition that you all are going through, to, again, a youth-led model and youth governance. What are the one or two things that are you're excited about that you see on the horizon as this moves forward, and that other people can learn from?
Okay, so I think, I mean, when I say to my children, you can't help me if you don't listen. So the idea of listening is critical, and that comes from respecting people, even as we're making decisions about young people or about our communities. Listening, people are saying things, and we're so busy trying to protect the way things were. So being able to just be humble, be quiet, and listen has been very challenging for me. I'm not going to say that it isn't. Total transparency, but this idea of being accountable to the community, accountable to the mission, and inviting people and sustaining our organization through that. Most of the people who are associated with our organization, I feel very blessed. They want to stay connected. They're like, maybe I'm not going to be this in the future. Maybe I can serve on the board. Or even as they move away and go to college, they come back and say, hey, I'd like to collaborate, or I'd like to. So that idea of taking care of relationships, I would say, like, relationships are the hugest resource that we have, and taking care of those is really part of the sustainability. And where we're moving to, it feels new. We're kind of shaking off models, but this is really old. It's a village. It's based on agreement. It's based on taking care of each other. And I was asked recently by funders, like, what are the trends? Where are we going to? I'm like, everything is always moving back to the village. It's our natural unit of living, of being. And so, yeah, that's it. These are not new.
So we did have one question from the audience that I'll throw out, asking if you could say a little bit more about the organizing strategy of the young people and how it grew, right? So they had an idea, wanted to have their voice heard, and 15,000 people later.
15,000.
15, okay. 15,000, that's a lot of people. 15,000 people later, we have a movement grounded in Baltimore, to your point, part of a continuum. So how did they grow that? How did that happen?
They worked tirelessly. And like I said, some things were from scratch. They made relationships with people, and they worked together. We should add that this is during a pandemic. It's really
right.
A lot of, like, right. But in some ways, I think that people have this restless energy, one, and also they're looking and reevaluating everything. So I think that while there's some obstacles regarding the pandemic, I think that those two things were working on the side of people not being so apathetic, because that's also what we're about, fighting apathy, which a lot of times comes from people being unaware and feeling helpless. And so, they were deeply in alignment. People were ready for it. So they connected with other organizations that knew the pieces to make it safe. What happens if people, because it was dangerous, like at any point that you're doing this, you have to be aware that people are overlaying their agendas. I was very proud of them in that way, because even people's ego, not even something really sinister, you see these young people organizing something, and there were people who want to come and co-opt that. for their own, you know, agenda, even just based on ego and other things. So they had a lot of things that they were weighing and dealing with, and they were very passionate, but they worked tirelessly day and night, and they connected with people who helped them with that blueprint. Like, hey, you're going to need medics. You're going to need, we're going to need masks. We're going to need hand sanitizer. Of course, what showed up was more than they could have really prepared for. But people showed up that accountability mission was there, so that the people that showed up came with that mission, all to protect the mission. We actually had some conversations about language, because they were like, we need people to help enforce the COVID guidelines. Mm-hmm. You know, they were thinking about all of these things. And I said, I invite us to some different language, because the idea of enforce, while we're talking about re-examining how police operate in our communities, I invite us to the concept of guardianship, and that everybody is guarding the mission. And so we know that people want to do the right things and people want to be safe. So we don't have to work against them in their own benefit. So like that alone was like a learning moment for us all, like even how we use our language and call people to accountability, not through force or enforcement, but through the mission. Like, we're here for a purpose guiding our accountability.
Got it. Thank you so much, Olu. I am incredibly proud of the work of Dewmore and what you have enabled for youth in Baltimore City. So thank you for this lightning bolt, and we'll be back for more Q&A after the fireside chat. So we're going to switch now to hear from Kera and Tiffany to talk a little bit about governance and accountability in some different ways that are moving currently. So we'll start with Kera, who is again the transition manager for the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. And so this initiative started about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, even on the ballot. So Kera, if you could talk to us just a little bit about the background of BCYF and where it is now, and then we'll dig in a bit to all these competing voices and what the authorizing environment is in which BCYF is now operating.
Thank you, Erika. So we're really talking about, before we talk about BCYF, we want to back up a little bit. We're really talking about philanthropy. We are a grant-making institution, and traditionally in philanthropy, we know that there is a system set up that results in organizations that are led by people of color, that often serve people of color, getting fewer dollars with more restrictions. It's sort of a secret society of who gets in, who gets funded, who gets to do what's considered important work. And it's typically what the foundation wants versus what community is saying that we need. And so BCYF was founded out of this to say the community should be deciding what gets funded in community. Taxpayer dollars should be spent on what people think their communities need, and they should have a voice in that. And so there was an organization, local organization called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle that really advocated that we do grant making in a different way in support of the grassroots organizations that have been doing really the yeoman's work for many years and not able to access and tap that system that frankly is what I call run by the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. They'd been locked out. And so even with this idea, this concept, there was a lot of pushback in the philanthropic sector because it was changing the way things are typically done. A couple of mayors ago, it was vetoed as a concept, and then it was placed on the ballot for a referendum in 2016. 85% of Baltimore City voters voted yes, that 3% of property tax dollars in perpetuity would be set aside for programs that support children, youth, and young adults, basically up to age 24. And so it started with that. And the concept was that decisions about who would receive grants would not be made behind closed doors by the leaders of industry, supporting what they think is important, but that it would be decided by community, a panel of community members. There was an open call for people to sit on this panel. 40% of that panel would need to be people under the age of 30, because why have adults, seniors, et cetera, make decisions about programs for young people? You're not in the program. You don't know whether it's effective. You don't know what the relationship is with young people. But 40% of the panel had to be folks under the age of 30 that were involved in making those decisions. And that community would decide even the priority areas. What is it that we should be funding? And so to give you an example, as we were doing a lot of the work in the community design sessions to determine what should we focus on, we were hearing things like, well, there's some great programs, but they take the child out of their neighborhood to someplace else. Or the one child can go, but two other children, either the age doesn't work or something has happened where they can't go together. And so now you have young people having to make a decision about, am I going to watch my siblings after school, or am I going to be in the program? Why can't we all be in the program together? And so we were hearing a lot of things like that, along with organizations saying, well, funders will make me decide what is the one small space that I serve in, as opposed to looking at what I do as a whole. Olu was talking about the village. People do a lot of different things. How do I reflect that in my grant application? And so all of those things were considered in putting together what the youth fund was going to focus on in this first year, how it was going to function and operate, and even in the governance structure. The idea is that this will not be a board, again, with leaders of large institutions that sit on other boards and what I call board collecting, but that it would be governed by community members that sit in that seat of power. That's a power seat. And we even saw that in putting together the transition board, which will determine what the governance structure look like. We're in a transition period. Even in that stage, we saw the tension and the pushback from people who really, quite frankly, tried to dismantle our board because the positions were held by community members. Power, this is my personal opinion, power is not the issue. It is how power is used, exercised, and wielded. And so when you have a system like philanthropy that has allowed people to use that power to their benefit, to their advantage, to become comfortable, it becomes very scary when something like a Baltimore Children Youth Fund comes along and says, not only are we not going to do this, but we're going to call it what it is and point it out so that other people see it as well. And so that's really what we're doing in our body of work. Is it perfect? No. But our goal is to really get at those deeper systems through our governance, through our accountability, through the voices that we listen to that guide the work as we move forward.
Thank you. So full disclosure, I am on the transition board of BCYF. So in some of these conversations on a regular basis. I'll ask you one question before we transition to Tiffany. What are some of the tensions inherent in that in terms of accountability? So you talked about power. Absolutely, that is a key feature, how it's wielded, who has it, who has access to it, how it's transitioned, all those things. But when you are looking at a government apparatus that demands a certain amount of transparency and accountability for every dime spent, and an intention, an entity that is centered racial equity in its approach and community voice, and transparency and process, all of those things create different sense of who's accountable for what, and some of those things are even in conflict with each other. So how is that tension from where you sit? How has it been managed? How is it being managed? Is it understood even at this point?
All great questions. So all of that happens. Yes, there is a lot of tension because there are different audiences. When we say community, community means different things to different people. And so we start with the difference between managing public funds and community-based organizations. And again, I just said earlier, Black-led institutions tend to get fewer dollars and dollars with more strings. No more strings than getting government funds. And so in many ways, it has been painful to watch what BCYF is trying to do and the values that we espouse, and realize, okay, this is coming, like just butting up immediately against organizations that are doing great work, but let's say can't quite meet city requirements. And so one of the things that I think has been helpful to us is, look, there are administrations that change every 4 years in Baltimore, a little bit more frequently lately. But there are administrations that change. One, we are a charter ordinance, so that money doesn't change regardless of who comes in as mayor. That money is set aside, so we start there. We're also really working with those in city government to explain to them, you say you support the youth fund, and we have had tremendous government support across city council, mayoral administrations, director of finance, et cetera. All of that is important. But to be able to sit down and say you support this, but the city policies look like this, or in some cases, you as an individual are doing these things, which actually is not aligned with BCYF's core values. I think we've been very lucky in that we haven't had, at the very basic level, a lot of interference from city officials that have tried to manipulate and control the process of who gets funded. We've seen that in other places. It doesn't work, it doesn't pan out well. So we've really been blessed in that aspect. But we do see that tension of the layers of accountability where we may be speaking to a community and they're saying, but I don't understand why you're putting all these restrictions on us. It's because it's taxpayer funds. We have accountability to the city. And so it's a dance, it's a constant dance, but BCYF has been able, Baltimore Children and Youth Fund has been able to do, for example, one thing that for us is incredibly important. And it's a small example, but what the city was doing was basically auditing down into grassroots organizations. So if you received a $4,000 grant, the city had the same expectation of you and would come in and audit you the same way they would audit an organization that maybe has an $80 million budget. And so from an equity perspective, our position is the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund should bear all of that. The audit should stop there. You should not be auditing beyond us. We will do the things, provide the supports to help the grantees, but the city should stick with the larger entity and take that hit if that's indeed what comes up. And so that's a small example of some of the areas where we're trying to change a system that doesn't necessarily support what we're trying to do. We haven't always gotten the transparency and accountability piece right in community. We're also trying to get to a point where it isn't, we do this over here. This is our part where we do our transparency and community piece, but to have that really begin to undergird everything that we're doing. So for example, our board meetings are now public, right? So it was the first last month, this month was the first time that we did that, and we'll continue to do that. So it's incremental. Again, it's a system that is not set up for different. We are considered otherness, and we're really trying to adjust, adapt, learn. We get a lot of feedback from community to try to integrate that, but also be able to show, okay, we hear you, here's where it can work, here's where it can't work, here's where we may need to think of what could potentially be a hybrid that satisfies both. But it is, it's a consistent dance.
Thank you so much. And I can attest to the discomfort of going through a process like that and the transparency that comes along with it. So, but definitely worthwhhile. So we're going to switch gears to like the complete, we talked about grassroots organizations and youth serving organizations and youth-led work. And now we're going to switch all the way over to the other end of the spectrum and start talking about capital markets and access to capital markets. And I say this is all on a spectrum, right? This isn't necessarily either or. What happens in one space actually does impact what happens in another. And so I'm really pleased to transition to Tiffany McGee, again, the CEO and Chief Investment Officer, Institutional Client Service at Momentum Advisors. And hi, Tiffany. This is day 2.
Going strong.
Still at it. Tiffany and I were on a webinar yesterday where we touched on some of these issues as well. So I'm really pleased to have you here, and want to chat a little about how this shows up in access to capital markets. So this is the asset management industry is a $70 trillion industry. And the titans of this industry are some of the wealthiest people in the world. They're moving money around, not necessarily producing anything, but less than 1.3% of that industry is managed by people of color owned and women owned asset management firms, like collectively, not either or, like together. And so the amount of wealth, the transfer of capital to networks beyond the usual that are held by the predominantly white male uh, uh, industry is an opportunity. The philanthropy, like there are a whole lot of reasons why we need to know who is in this industry and who's got access to money and where it's going. It even has policy implications because that's who's got access, right? Like that's the system as it's been set up. And so can you just talk a little bit about some of the places or the ways in which either from your role in some of the things that are happening in this industry that are seeking to make that change, right? Like to change that dynamic, move the needle even a little. And we want a bigger piece of the pie, but how do we start to make some changes such that 1.3% grows and there's more opportunity to unleash capital in communities that we do care about?
So I think I got the question.
I'll narrow it down in a second, but tell us about
I'll start with the that was a lot. Yeah, so thank you guys for having me, and I'm really excited about joining this discussion. So just to kind of like level set, my firm, Momentum Advisors, we are an investment advisory firm. So basically we give investment advice, and our clients are, in particular, my clients are foundations and endowments, institutional retirement plans. And so Erika, you actually gave a really great stat with talking about the $70 trillion in assets in this country. And so I'll give you another one. There's about 13 trillion in pension money, right? So that's teachers, that's police, that's firefighters, government workers. And so less than 1% of that money is managed by Black people, brown people, women, and you actually missed a few, Erika, veterans, people with disabilities, all of those categories, it's less than 1%. So when you think about, just people of color, it's way down there. So what we do is, primarily manage investment portfolios for these institutions. So we are a Black-owned firm. We're a Latino-owned firm, a woman-owned firm, part woman-owned firm. And so, we started, when I started this practice, I was in my loft, smiling and calling people. And so each member of my team came from larger institutions. My partner, Alan, came from Goldman Sachs. I came from, Merrill and T. Rowe and TIA. And so, one day we had the audacity to think that we could do it on our own. And so we did. And it was incredibly, really for me too, it was an incredibly, humbling experience, because I thought I was just going to bounce over and, change my email address and change, everything and just be Tiffany and call my old clients and say, hey, great news. And that really didn't happen. And it was 2.5 years before a paycheck. And it was a little bit crazy, but I really had to, dig deep and think about, why would someone hire me? Why would someone hire us versus some of these big firms? And that was definitely a journey for us. And so, and that's a bit of a different story, but I think going through that practice really helps us to understand that, to really understand what it is to be an entrepreneur, right? So not, I have a business card and I do something on the side, but we created an investment firm, like a couple people, right? Like I'm a little girl from Baltimore. I went to Mercy High School, and literally we managed close to $700 million right now. So how did we, kind of go through that whole entire journey? And so as we started to get, bring in more and more clients, one of the things that I realized, because in the beginning it is a little scary. I want to be able to pay my bills. I'm a single mom. I need to be able to, pay for tuition for my child and feed her, right? And so when we started to get some success, I really, and we're actually based in New York, and I still live here, but I'm back and forth normally under normal circumstances, back and forth to New York every other week. And so I really started to understand and realize that there was this huge discussion going on in asset management in the investment industry. So I attended every single thing because I was trying to build my network. And so I was always in these rooms with these very, very smart people. And usually I was in the audience with other Black and brown people, and they had all gone to like Harvard and Wharton and all these great schools, and they had funds, right? They were running their own funds, like hedge funds and private equity funds and venture funds and all these things. And on the panel was always someone called an allocator. And that allocator was like a head of a pension, possibly a consultant similar to myself that really selected where the money was going to be invested with what manager. And they're like gatekeepers. And so they were on these panels, and the people to my left and to my right were always asking the same questions. They were always doing the same thing. They were raising their hand and they were asking these people on the panel the best way to jump through their 1 million hoops. And I just thought something was wrong. I was like, wait a second, you guys went to Harvard and Wharton and are super smart. I know you have like student loans to pay off or something, because you are well educated, right? It's like the definition of Black excellence to my left and to my right. And I don't understand why the people on this panel don't get that all the research shows that your returns are better. So I'll just want to, I'll say that again. So all the research in my industry shows that returns of diverse owned asset managers overall outperform their counterparts, but yet they're not being allocated to. So I thought it was really weird. I thought surely I had missed something. So I was reading and reading and reading, and I'm huge with reading and trying to get to the right answer and really getting all the data and the information to make a decision. And it just didn't add up. And so then you have to ask this question: why, if they're making money, why aren't institutions or allocators investing in them? And of course, it really comes down, I think, overall to bias. I mean, sometimes there are technical issues, but there is a structure. So there is a structure that a criteria that automatically screens them out. So as a investment advisor or consultant, when I make a decision to invest, when I'm constructing a portfolio, right? So I'll buy individual stocks, I'll do mutual funds and also private funds. So I have a criteria. I have like an investment criteria that I look at, that I consider, and things like track record, right? So track record really speaks to, you're not going to invest in someone who worked at Dunkin' Donuts for like the past 15 years and all of a sudden wakes up and says, I'm going to start a fund. We're not going to invest in that person. But I will invest in someone who has been working for maybe another fund, maybe been in the investment industry doing something else, and has, really understands how to invest, right? So a lot of the criteria that's set up says that, these managers, for us to invest in you, you have to have like a 5-year track record or a 10-year track record. Okay. Track record means you had an SEC track record, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the law in my world, says that it's very specific in terms of what you can consider a track record. It's got to be a fund that you managed, and there are all these criteria. So consultants, my counterparts say, okay, 5-year track record, 10-year track record. And also, we're going to need you to have a certain amount of AUM, assets under management. So we're already going to need you to have money that you're investing. Usually, maybe that's like around $80 million. So before we even take a meeting with you, you're going to have to at least be in business, have done this in this current fund for at least 5 to 10 years. And you got to have, and I'm just making this up, but it's somewhere around this $80 million for us to even consider you. And actually, for you to even show up on a screen, for us to even know that you exist, right? So we started looking at that, and I don't know how much time I have, but I'm gonna kind of wrap it up. But we started looking at that, and we thought it was the most ridiculous thing, because as an investor, what I really need to do for my clients is make money. I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but I really want, I have to chase what's called or find what's called alpha, which is a measure of excess return, and I have to reduce risk, and I have to do it in the most fee conscious way possible. But here I was seeing these managers that were outperforming. I just didn't understand that. So our process is totally different than, say, a lot of other consulting firms out there. And number one, we don't have that bias because we look the way that we do, right? So these asset managers, these diverse owned asset managers, they're our friends. We went to school with them. We hang out with them. We belong to a lot of the same organizations. We believe in the same things. So that element wasn't there. But we really began to put into process, create a model of what we were already doing, right? To kind of formalize the model a little bit more so that we could really, more as like a communication tool to clients and to the community, to let them know that we were kind of dismantling this whole archaic model of this set criteria that screened these managers out. So I'm going to stop and see if you have a question, because I feel like I've been talking for like 16 million years.
No. I'd make no assumptions about where people will come into the conversation to really understand kind of how these barriers get put in place in this otherwise, opaque industry, right? And where some of the accountability kind of comes into play, or not in this case, right? So there's nothing that says that firms have to, meet certain criteria in terms of diversity, or we see it in some of the public pension space where there are programs or requirements in terms of working with emerging and diverse managers, but that's not across the board. And so in the absence of accountability, we see how this kind of plays out for firms that are performing, quite frankly, and not being selected because of other criteria that are put in place. So bringing it back around to the conversation around governance and accountability, have you seen any effort or any features that are starting to take this seriously, right? So I know we have this entire impact investing space that's coming up that's looking at ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues to consider whether or not businesses or investment strategies are either doing harm or just simply doing no harm, right? And so can you build things that are actually advancing opportunity in those spaces as well? We recently, the SEC was challenged to put some new regulations in place around reporting on diversity metrics. So can you just give us a little bit of insight to either a glimmer of hope or how to start thinking about, or how this industry can be challenged in some of these practices around governance, and where those levers are happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is I will kind of start with the time that we're in. Is a very different time, and I'm going to speak from like socially, and then also from the industry. So if I would say up till about January 2020, the stock market had really been in this place where we were up over 210%. It was maybe a little bit more than that. The longest, bull market of all time, over 10 years, up market. And you could basically do anything you wanted. I say that with a grain of salt, and make money. So you have these things called index funds, which basically track the index. You just put your money in there, and you're buying basically a broad basket of stocks. So like the S&P, the NASDAQ is more tech heavy. And you're just buying the market. So if you just did that, the whole market was going up, that's great. You really don't have to pick individual stocks. You don't have to have this, you know, great expert knowledge or crystal ball. So kind of, you know, what happens in that is that the market is cyclical. And so what goes up must come down. There's a business cycle, there's a market cycle. And the conversation that everybody was having is, when is the market going to turn? When is it going to go down? And, you know, of course you don't have a crystal ball, but how do we position portfolios to be braced for that moment when the market goes down? And so everybody was chasing or looking for what's called uncorrelated assets, right? So like investments that aren't correlated, don't move in the same way or a predictable way with stocks and bonds. So that kind of flowed into alternative investments like private equity, venture, real estate, and hedge funds. So that was the whole conversation, like over and over again, over and over again. Flash forward to, you know, end of February, 2020, we're in this whole different crazy environment, right? So COVID happens, we're all in quarantine, the entire world changes. Then we kind of flow into, you know, and I hesitate to say Black Lives Matter, because it's been going on for, you know, this is not the first time, but with the recent protests, we kind of flow into that. And so prior to this, one of the things that, you know, I thought of when we were, you know, 2019, these uncorrelated assets and alternative investments, is I found what I like to call the next generation of alpha identifiers, right? And so remember, alpha is excess return, and everybody wants alpha. So that was first-time funds, diverse-owned asset managers, and ESG and impact investing, and also investing in emerging markets, right, overseas. And so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And basically what it is taking the responsible metrics, those responsible metrics of a company, and lining them up alongside the traditional financial metrics that you would use to, to identify, that you would use to determine whether you want to invest in a company or a strategy. And they really are able to identify companies with sound management. Companies with sound management lead to better returns. Great. But there was this conversation in the industry that said, okay, that really kind of, pushed ESG aside and said, you know what, that's really just for the tree huggers and for the people who want to do good, and you're sacrificing return, you're not going to make any money, from that, even though the research shows that you do. So now we're in this environment where, before it's really easy to track whether the E, right? So in the environmental stuff. So a company that has low carbon emissions, oh, okay, so you're maybe not spending money on energy. Great, that's very easy to see. The S, social metrics, that was a little bit harder, right? And then the governance, that was a little bit harder too, right? Yeah, you can count how many women you have in a firm. The gender pay, equity kind of gap wasn't really being disclosed. Yes, you can count how many people of color, but that really wasn't being talked about. Flash forward now, when you've got looking at companies and how corporations and how they've responded to COVID-19, how they have treated their employees, how they've treated their customers, everything down from like safety to, are we laying you off right now? And then going to go pay our shareholders a dividend? All of those things, it's feeding additional data into that S metric. And then of course, with the recent protest, and recent, again, it's not recent, but Black Lives Matter, we've seen all of these companies, every single company known to man that I could possibly think of has issued a Black Lives Matter statement. So these are all social metrics. So now what we're seeing is where we didn't have a ton of social metrics before, now we have a ton now. And we're seeing, I believe, the S affect the G. So if you remember that weekend when all the protests erupted, by Sunday night, every single company came out with a statement. Every single day it was like boom, 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 boom. By the end of the week, companies were starting to, oh, we're going to donate money. That next week was a lot of donation. And then by the next week, it was a lot of chatter on social media to say, okay, listen, put your money where your mouth is. How many Black people and calling it what it is. How many Black people do you have in your management? How many Black people do you have in your C-suite on your board? And we saw companies like Adidas, like, Nike and so many, Puma, come out and say, we're committed to doing this. And so I know the S is now affecting the G. And what it comes down to is, how does that make money? So what we've seen over time is that with all of these metrics, with companies that start with poorer metrics, if they improve over time, it definitely leads to their bottom line. So let me just explain really quickly what I mean by that. If you have a policy in place for diversity, that's great. But it can't just be a policy that you state or transparency. It's got to be a policy that has measured progress. So we've seen, and Goldman Sachs has a research report on this, that if a company comes out and says, hey, we have a responsible policy around X, and then they don't report back the progress, that tends to underperform. So that now you're getting money taken away, right? Your stock is going down. But if you report this measured progress, then that contributes to your alpha. It contributes to your outperformance. Basically, you're making money. So this concept is not really being talked about a lot. I talked about it this morning. It's not being talked about a lot because I am really passionate about the fact that, a lot of people, again, relegate ESG to, oh, it's tree huggers and you want to save the world. And, I would love to save the world. But at the end of the day, my job is to make money for my clients. And the sooner people understand that, honestly, these responsible practices like diversity, if you do it and if you say you're going to do it and you actually do it, it's better for everybody because you're making money.
Thank you. So what I find incredibly interesting, and we can bring Olu back because we'll start to wrap this up. But one of the things that I find incredibly interesting is that 15,000 that the Dewmore brought out, right? Like ultimately that was happening all over the country. That influenced what Tiffany was seeing, right? In terms of all these companies having to respond. And so Dewmore is also a BCYF funded initiative. So having the resources available to continue to support this work. These things are not disconnected. They're not, what happens here doesn't matter over here. And I, Olu, please let the young people in the program know, like this actually matters. So you have to, kind of have to keep at it, but this does matter in the grand scheme of things, because it was the level of outrage and protest and vocal protest that was causing a lot of this, people having to pay attention and respond and send out statements. And now, because those statements are out here, it becomes an accountability to what you said and you made public. And now we're paying attention, we're watching, we have the opportunity to hold you to what it is that you said you value. And so one of the fundamentals of systems thinking is that if you want to know the purpose of a system, you watch its behavior. You don't pay attention to the stated values or the rhetoric. Watch the behavior of the system to see what happens next. And so, one, I'll open it up to any questions from our participants on this particular panel or in this webinar. But I do want to ask all of our panelists, Kera, Tiffany, Olu, to talk a little bit, just give us we have about 10 minutes left, but if you can tell us what are you hopeful for right now in this moment? What is driving hopefulness for you from where you sit, what you're seeing, what you are, what you're experiencing right now?
I was actually just going to make a great point, Erika, to what you just said, because I think that the point that you made about the connection between, my business and what I do in investing, and that you made with Olu and the young people and the protest is very key. all Americans aren't investors. I sit and talk about investments all the time, and not everybody is in a position to invest, but all Americans are consumers. And, they're putting pressure on all of these companies, on companies like Starbucks, and, Nike's actually in a really good place right now, but Starbucks and, Facebook and all of these things, that makes me incredibly hopeful. So, Facebook, so what's going on right now, in case you got, not right now, but what's going on at 4:00 is, the four biggest tech companies are reporting earnings, right? So that's Facebook, that's Amazon, that's Google, that's Apple, and they dominate all the markets. They dominate the S&P. The S&P index, 500 index, is up maybe about 1% for the whole entire year if you take those stocks out. Those individual stocks, I think like between Apple and Amazon, Apple's up 29% compared to 1%, right? They're dominating everything. And so all the pressure that's been put on Facebook, I'm very hopeful about that, because all of their advertisers have come out, and there's a lot of chatter that says, okay, well, I mean, listen, Facebook's like the biggest social media platform. They're going to go back in. And my question is, and I said this on CNBC, and I said, who's going to be the first one back in? Starbucks can't be the first one back in. They already have too many issues. And so I really do feel like we are in the Super Bowl of ESG right now, where, these protests and these movements are really affecting the bottom line, and people have to listen. So I'm hopeful about that.
Olu?
Well, as an engineer, I'm not afraid of numbers, but I like to talk about energy, the artist part of me. So right now is a time where the will of the people is not to be ignored. And anybody that is kind of resistant to that may get left behind. So the will of the people and not being afraid of the people, we have all these things in place like the Electoral College and even the way our government is structured to kind of insulate against what people want, are interested in, are passionate about. But this is a time to like just really lean into that and relate to it, find our position with that. So I'm very hopeful about that. There was also a question somebody had, I don't know if this is a bad or good time or we're summing everything up, but about organizations that how can they that have low or small organizations and how they can do this work. And I would say some simple surveying. The idea of listening is not as expensive as you think it is. So I just wanted to put that out there. Surveying people around us that we serve, et cetera, like take the time, survey in the way that they would respond. Don't just like send them a survey if you don't feel like that's how they would respond. Taking that time to listen. So that's it.
Thank you, Kera. What's got you hopeful?
So I tend to be a half glass empty person. I could find a problem with like puppies and rainbows. But what I am excited by right now is there really seems to be a line drawn in the sand. And it is a question of which side are you standing on? And you better not be on the wrong side right now. To Tiffany's point, people are voting with their dollars. For Olu and her world, people are voting with their feet and their voice. It is also an election year. And what I am encouraged by is even in philanthropy, which typically has not moved, we are seeing more progressive organizations start to move in a different direction. But also what I'm noticing is, and it's been happening for a little while, but really is now gaining momentum, is we're seeing a bit of the generational divide where younger folks, and I use that term loosely, but basically those that are 45 and under, because philanthropy tends to be very old, 45 and under they've identified inequity, they are bothered by it, and they are trying to figure out how do we put our money in places that we say really matters. No more of the, well, we'd like to do this because I went to college with this person and this is what we've traditionally done. It's like, nope, here's the line. Are we going to be on the left or on the right? And if you're on the wrong side of it, people are going to call you out. To Tiffany's point, they're also going to say, we are no longer going to buy your stuff. Whatever it is, the answer is no. And so to me, it's encouraging to see folks that have fought this battle for so long, often very unpopular and ostracized, now is looking around and saying, wow, there are a lot of people around us. And I know that probably feels a certain kind of way, but the will of just so many people, so many different folks that have gotten fat, happy, and lazy off of an existing system are even waking up and saying, you know what? Actually, I've seen the error of this system and I want to be part of making it right. That is what is making me, for this particular issue, a half glass full person.
Okay. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences, what you're learning, what you're thinking, what you're seeing at this point in time. So I'm hearing things around, I love the notion of guardianship, the idea of guardianship. I am loving this. This connection among all of these spaces, because one does influence the other. And so being clear about, again, that spectrum and not operating in silos and how these systems intersect and overlap, and accountability up and down, right? So it's not just within one sphere. The accountability question is open right about now, because we can see it operating in a lot of different ways. And we're in a space of power being transitioned and being opened up for more people to have voice in these processes. So again, I thank you all so much for being here. I will turn this over to Michelle to wrap it up and close out for us. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank all of our audience for being here as well. So Michelle, it's up to you.
Thanks, everybody. It's really incredible to draw this line from grassroots all the way up to our markets, and really value all the contributions and the conversation today. I wanted to just also thank our sponsors again: University of Maryland Masters in Health and Social Innovation, Kaiser Permanente, Hopkins Social Innovation Lab, PNC Bank, Eleanor Smith Consulting, and the Kamak Family Gift Fund, who have really flowed with us as we're working in a responsive way to what's going on in the landscape, and really appreciate the support that they've lent to this work. And I think this conversation is a really excellent transition into where we're headed next. So I think Tiffany said that these movements are affecting the bottom line, and that's exactly the conversation we're gonna go to in August, where we're gonna talk about corporate commitments to advancing race equity and how people are translating those statements into real action. And so we'll hear about what that looks like internal to the corporate space, and just stay tuned to SOCAP and Impact Hub Baltimore's channels to get the date and the speakers confirmed. They'll be coming soon, and really appreciate everybody's time and just the work that you all do every single day to move this work forward. Thanks so much.